Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to the first technical meeting of the year by the AACE International Meeting. My name is Frank, and I'll be the host of the session today, and it's very amazing to have attendees not only from all over Australia, but from other countries, including South and North America. Today's webinar is about the state of project controls and its implications for cost professionals. Before getting started, I'll introduce Paul Harris, the current president of the AACE Australian section, who will run a few slides regarding the association. He will also introduce our speaker for tonight.
Oh, good evening. My name is Paul Harris. I'm the president of AACE Australian section, and this is a technical meeting, 8th of February 2021. The agenda, we go through the meeting procedures quickly. I introduce you to AACE International Australian section for those people who are visitors. Each presentation, I introduce a different part of the AACE International website. We'll look at volunteer opportunities today. We've got the AGM on the 11th of March, so I just want to touch on the AGM on the 11th of March. We then welcome Sally to talk about the state of project controls, implications for cost professionals, and this is a very interesting presentation. We then have a survey, and then final questions to the speakers, so you'll have an opportunity to ask any questions. And then once the presentation is over, we have an open mic session where everybody can speak, and you can say hello to whoever you like and ask any questions to anybody. So it's trying to make it as much as a meeting as I can. So the meeting procedures, all the attendees will be muted during the presentations. We'll unmute you after the final questions. You will have an opportunity to interact at key points in the presentation. So through the presentation, Sally will stop and allow you to ask questions. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, then please let us know using the Teams chat feature. So type your question in or your comment, and then Frank will read them out at the appropriate time. We'll make this webinar available on the AACE Australian section YouTube channel after this session. The slideshow will be published on our website, and if you wish to have a certificate of attendance, please email your details to info@aaci.org.au and we'll provide you with a certificate. A little bit about AACE. It stands for the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering. It serves the total cost management community. It's been around since 1956. We're committed to the constructive exchange of ideas between members, the development of technical guidelines and quality education. And you'll find the guidelines are in the form of recommended practices and also a document called Total Cost Management Framework. We certainly recognize subject matter experts. And sorry, my phone just rang and I had to turn it off. We do recognize subject matter experts. Just having a look at our board in Australia, we got most of the people are in Victoria, so we are looking for more blood, particularly in WA and Queensland, New South Wales. Just talk about the AACE International website. There are volunteering opportunities, and this is found on the website under certification volunteering opportunities. And if you go to that link, you'll find that they're always looking for technical paper graders. They're looking for speciality memo or essay graders, and they're looking for people to write and submit new exam questions. So if you're interested in getting involved, I've certainly been involved in reviewing recommended practices. I've reviewed about 15 of them in the last year and suggested changes. There's always room for opportunities to volunteer. Moving on, these are the contact details for AACE in the US or the Australian section. That's their website and our website. The Australian section AGM, we have an AGM on the 11th of March, and the AACE Australian section invites you to nominate for a position with your professional community, which is dedicated to enhancing project professional skills and knowledge. Why not put yourself up for a position? Think of yourself as a committee member. You might ask, what's in it for me? Well, some of the benefits are, first of all, you can empower and practice your leadership skills. You can expand your network. You can enhance your career prospects. Certainly employees prefer people who have more personal skills and do volunteering work. And also the satisfaction of making a contribution to the success of AACE Australia. We're specifically looking for a secretary. Karen is resigning, so the secretary is a mandatory position. So if you feel like contributing a couple of hours a week as the secretary, that would be really good. So I'd like to welcome Sally Glen. She's going to talk about the state of project controls and the implications for cost professionals. The study provides practical and implementable tips to the effective implementation of project control practices and improve capital project predictability. So I would like to hand over to Sally now.
Okay. Great. Good evening, everybody. Thanks to AACE and the committee for inviting me to speak tonight. I do see a few names on the list that I know, so hi to anyone who I've met before. My name is Sally Glen. I run the Australian operation here at IPA. I'm also the global business leader for mining, minerals and metals for IPA. I've been working in capital projects for 25 years and I've actually been at IPA for nearly 13 years. Started my career in Rio Tinto, actually in Tom Price in the Pilbara of WA. So spent a lot of time in WA and around Australia and around the world. And I've personally reviewed hundreds of capital projects, both from the very small sustaining capital variety all the way through to giga scale ventures. Let's see, all right, let's move to that one. Thank you. So just a little bit about IPA. We have a database of nearly 21,000 projects with data collected directly from owner organisations. We're a leading advisory firm on capital projects. The part of our name is important. We are independent. So when we review a project, it is our independent view of the status of that project and the risks of going forward. We are a projects only consulting firm. We're not going to come in and fix your pay system or anything like that. We only study capital projects, the organisations, the governance structures, the metric systems, and the work process that is needed to define and execute capital projects. So we work around the world. We work with leading organisations around the world across all sectors. We're globally represented. These boxes across the bottom here just indicate that we use the databases, which is from your projects in industry, to conduct research like the research I'm presenting to you tonight. To then also feed back to those projects and clients that we're working with, so that we're giving up-to-date, information on best practice and also what's happening in the state of projects. And we're constantly seeking to, validate and make sure that our recommendations are actionable and pragmatic and actually provide, business value. Our experience in Australia is considerable. We've been in Australia since 1993. We have in that time, conservatively, I would say, assessed around $600 billion worth of capital spend in the country for future assets for the majors, the juniors, the joint venture partners, and even some contractors. The span of projects includes infrastructure, resources, chemicals, refining, utilities, renewables and technology. I will say that this particular study is a downstream study. It does not contain oil and gas or upstream projects. That's not to say that the content doesn't apply to those projects. It's simply that this was for a downstream conference. So why do clients come to IPA? Well, it's definitely to improve, to proactively and strategically improve and to strive for best in class, but it is also to avoid project failure. it's a kind of a sound motivation. You know, it's a constant theme of establishing skills and practices to avoid project failure, both in Australia and globally. If you Google, you know, mega project or project failures or cost blowouts, unfortunately there are quite a few in the public domain, and no matter how you define them, they are painful. There's examples of loss of reputation and unwanted media attention, of course, financial loss, both owner and contractor. There's examples of projects halting strategic plans for organisations. These projects, if they're in distress, involve extreme professional stress, and team member attrition is quite common. We can even, in the worst cases, actually have the project not produce as expected or suffer productivity loss. And of course, it diverts resources. So if you've got a portfolio that has a collection of projects that are going along quite well and you have a failed or an in distress project, that project attracts the resources and maybe drains the resources from the rest of the portfolio. So it's damaging. It can then damage projects that were on an otherwise quite sound track. So the topic of this briefing is, you know, the state of project control. So how are we doing, and what can we do about it? When we interview the various project teams that we speak to every year, somewhere around the vicinity of 700 projects a year, IPA, as our day-to-day business, collects project data around the status of all aspects of a project, including the level of project controls. So if it's a completed project, we call the rating at that time the actual project control index. So it's the actual level of project controls that the project implemented and executed as it went through design, procurement and construction. If we are looking at a project that is about to be authorised, get its full funds authorisation, then we call that rating a planned project control index. So it's an assessment of the planned level of preparedness for controls that the team states they are intending to put in place, and we look for evidence, etc. So on top of the regular project reviews, and I'll present some data shortly on from Project Controls Index, in addition to that, and for this study, we studied an additional set of factors, organisational, contract and work process factors. What we wanted to do was to get the controller's perspective around the barriers that they see and observe and work through to effective controls in the projects and portfolios that they're working in. So, and I'll talk a little bit about the methodology in a second. So first of all, let's look at a time trend in relation to what's the state of project controls. To introduce this chart, on the left-hand side is IPA's Project Control Index. I'm not presenting the details of that here. If you want to know, get in touch with me. But we rate it, as I indicated, either at full funds authorisation or at project completion. And this graph is actually showing the actual level of project control over time, you know, over approximately a decade from 2007. These are for large-ish projects and not very small projects, over $10 million US. And essentially you can see it's a fairly flat line. There may be a slight improvement here towards the end of the time trend, but it is essentially, you know, very, very flat. So that leads us to essentially say that based on the components of the Project Control Index, which according to our research are the elements of project controls that statistically correlate to improved project outcomes, especially predictability. And they are in relation to establishing the estimating processes for control and then planning to do control. So there's two main components of that index. So, you know, essentially project controls haven't really improved in around a decade. Now, if we take a look at our plans at full funds authorisation for controls, which is the pale green. So you can actually see here that our plans, doesn't look like a big amount, but they actually were exceeded what we ended up implementing. So what that means is that we're not, for a variety of reasons, maybe following through on our planned levels of project controls. So something's happening here that is stopping us from following through on our planned implementation for project controls. And we're going to look into, what that is. So when we dig into the project control index a little more, we see about 1 in 4 projects, their project controls index worsens from plan to actual. And when we see that, it's basically because they're not generating the reports according to best practice, and we're also not implementing or not doing physical progressing. And then there are some projects where they were not doing both of those things. So they planned to do them, but then they didn't do them in the end. Now, we've got previous research at IPA that shows that biweekly reporting directly correlates to improving schedule effectiveness. So essentially your execution schedule speed. And the research shows that physical progressing does reduce schedule slip. So both of these areas do have a direct impact on project outcomes. So, and we can actually, quantify that, and we know that it's approximately, when project controls deteriorate between planned and actual, so during execution, the result is generally worse predictability, and it's both cost and schedule that deteriorate by around 10% each on average. So the question for us was, why are we not improving project controls? Why are we not able to stick to our plans, and how can we avoid the situation? So that's what has led to this study, which was presented at our annual consortium last year. So the study objectives were aimed at, from a controller's perspective, identifying the main barriers that prevent project controls from being implemented effectively. Our view was, our hypothesis was that if we knew what these barriers were, then we'd have some ideas on how to avoid those or start breaking those habits, and how to then make the most out of project controls. So what we set out to do was to provide recommendations to overcome those barriers, and those recommendations are around best practices for system improvement. I mean, ideally we do want the gold standard long term, and we want that to be sustainable. And also we collected and catalogued and assimilated a bunch of key tips directly from project controllers, and some of those are quite handy to know, I think, and implementable, as we mentioned earlier. The study approach involved a survey. So we got survey results from project controllers from nearly 40 companies, with multiple respondents from each company, and that survey involved 50 questions. So, as I mentioned at the start, we ended up breaking the findings up into 3 areas: organisations, contracts, processes and tools. Let's get into organisations. What we found in the study was, as you can see in this chart, over half of controllers rated project controls, their project controls organisation and resources, from between fair to poor across a Likert scale that went from poor to excellent. So, although we didn't get direct answers to this question on why that was, there were subsequent questions that allowed us to explore potential answers to this. So we found patterns in other questions that have helped us understand why this rating was more negative than it was positive. What we found was that 1 in 5 participant companies don't have a formal projects organisation. So when we asked the question, does your project have a formal project control functional organisation separate from the project organisation or separate from the project, around 56% said yes, 19% were sure and they said no, and yet there were multiple respondents from the remaining 25% from the same company where some said yes and some said no. So that group saying we're really not sure, we believe is a reflection that something's not going well. Now, when you don't have a project controls organisation, you're brought into a project and you're on your own. There's no safety net outside the project, and there's no outside organisation to help manage corporate standards or systems related to project controls. No organisation to ensure independence of the function, adequate resources, workforce planning, and all the benefits that the organisation provides. So when there's no formal organisation, that's only part of the problem. When there's no formal organisation, what tends to happen is the project control systems are less likely to be ready for execution. And by systems, we mean software, accounts set up, mechanisms for collecting data, measuring progress, etc. And interestingly, the survey also showed that having a formal organisation actually didn't even directly mean that you would always have your project control systems ready for execution. So in fact, there was 40% of the respondents who were part of a formal controls organisation, and they still indicated that their systems were not ready. And we'll talk about this a bit more later. When there's no formal organisation, it did appear that it was more likely that the project managers would have a higher influence on the contents of the project controls reports. So too much influence may result in less transparency and may result in lack of accuracy. So it isn't a good practice. It is best practice to have a level of independence to the project controls organisation. However, again, half of the respondents who did have a formal controls organisation still indicated that the project manager had a high influence on reporting. So that was also challenging. A further consequence of not having a formal controls organisation was that controller roles were often staffed late. Now, we know from other research that early staffing does enable controllers to set up your control systems and processes, and importantly, and we'll talk about this again, it facilitates controllers being involved in key decisions in the project and also is linked to the next section around contracting. So around 4 in 5 of the controllers surveyed that were assigned during FEL3 or the feasibility study or FEED, depending on what you call it, or execution. So 4 in 5 of those that were installed between FEED and execution, of course, felt that was too late, which is probably correct. And I think probably in terms of staffing timing, the beginning is important. The beginning is where you set up the project and you're participating with the key stakeholders and being involved in those key decisions. If you enter later than that, then you are entering late and you are entering after some of those key decisions are made. Controllers reported being spread too thin when there was no formal project controls organisation. They gave examples of having insufficient time to dedicate to individual projects, and they also spoke about not having time to support and work through, educate and coach contractor controls quality. Now, in this area, I'm talking about owner to contractor, but the same could apply if you're a prime contractor and you've got subcontractors. If you don't have enough people in your core controls organisation, then they don't have the time to dedicate to supporting your contractors. And of course, contractors are critical. Every organisation these days needs support and contractor involvement to deliver their projects. We can't deliver our projects without contractors. The final area in terms of no project controls organisation that the controllers talked about was the inefficiencies caused when there was a lack of integration between controls into the project teams. So the effect of that inefficiency was that you often don't get the information you need. The project's organisation doesn't understand or value what is being produced, and accordingly that means that maybe there's consequences with the resources and the tools and the systems and the data that you get allocated. We had examples of project controllers having to justify their existence and certainly feeling less motivated. So there's a fair bit of waste associated with that lack of integration. Okay, so what did we find about what needs to be done to improve the project controls organisation aspect of this? So, of course, if you don't have a project controls organisation, we would recommend establishing a formal project controls organisation. It should be in charge of things like maintaining databases, tools and templates, developing processes, competency, care for controllers, career paths, etc. That organisation would also make sure that control systems are ready before execution and ensure independence and authority of controls. The second item is to staff early and to staff appropriately. By staffing early, ideally it's in FEL 1 or 2. FEL 2 is probably the more common area to start. And we did note that if you're weak in terms of infrastructure, that hiring does need to be with high experience. So you can use that experienced controller then to assist you to then build that infrastructure. Lastly, we need to provide support to the controls function. They need to have a seat at the table for management decisions. They need to be understood and respected by management, the project team, procurement, contractors, and other stakeholders. So what can we do to work around some of these challenges? And the controller tips for dealing with organisational issues was largely around establishing the value for project controls. So doing the work, doing the educational work, convincing management to hire more resources, and making sure that the value of project controls, the role of project controls is understood by the team and management. One suggestion was that along with having project controls, having a seat at the table and attending project meetings, that the lead project engineer or project manager also then attend the project controls kickoff meetings and the lead project controls meetings, so that there's a cross-fertilisation and understanding, a real innate understanding between the groups. The key controller tips for dealing with staffing issues was really to tackle that hiring question, with management. So, and that may be being creative. That may be meaning that you might hire, agency staff, or you hire a combination, controller or scheduler. So it just depends. You may second people in, but it does actually that was some of the ways that they dealt with those issues, and to focus on training. So to train those key team members and make sure that people were following capital management processes, and to work to eliminate any duplication. So we've just, before we move on to contracts, this was a time, Frank, if there's any questions on the organisation.
Yes, certainly. We have two questions. The first, it's made by Andrew. Another problem often encountered more and more now is the overlapping of P6, one which is true and a site-verified version, which is established by the contractor. Another version is slightly sanitized for uploading into the client's enterprise P6 system. How can this wasteful practice can be reduced?
Okay, I think I'm just going to have to read it myself, if that's all right.
Yeah, you can check it in the conversation chat box. I don't understand.
Overlapping between owner and contractor. Okay, that one's quite a complicated question. I might have to take that offline. I'm not sure I can answer that just off the top of my head. I'm not fully understanding. Sorry, Andrew.
Okay. Then Karen asked, what's the experience continuing to engage the estimator from VEET through the execution in some way?
Yes, estimators definitely have a role in all the way through, you know, to the end of feed, and I've actually never really seen an estimator disappear off a project just because they've entered into execution. So yes, I think my experience is that engagement with the estimator, there is some research to suggest that a project controls manager can assist to mitigate when there's turnover of the project manager, because they are so close to the key decisions of the project that they then that knowledge from the project manager is not lost. And I think that probably also applies, you know, to the estimator if they're involved through the project. So I think that is a positive practice, Karen.
Good. We have another interesting couple of questions. What are the main challenges faced by project controllers due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic situation?
COVID-19 is definitely having procurement impacts. If it's a question from here in Australia, we're very fortunate that we haven't had so many, you know, sites affected by COVID. But yeah, it's mostly procurement and also QA/QC that has been affected. But if you would like more information on that, IPA has been running a variety of surveys, but also some public domain panels with clients. And so some of that information is available on our website. So you can also take a look there or come back and get in touch if you want more information. Okay, so I think we'll probably stop it at 2 or 3 questions each time, if that's all right. Now, okay, so we've, you know, your organisation might well be in great shape, but if project controls requirements are in the contracts are not in good shape, then you're also at risk of not being able to do your job properly. So we've seen this happen even in companies that generally, you know, do project controls well. So I've got a little story here that I'll just tell you about. So there was this big company that was working with a contractor on a reimbursable contract. The contract was very general in terms of project controls. The project started going badly and the owner company had no way of knowing what was going wrong. It wasn't a new contractor that they were dealing with, but the contractor was busy with another project. And because there was nothing specified in the contract, there was nothing that the owner company could demand. The project ended up on a high cost growth and schedule slip path. This failure can't even be used to understand what went wrong or when things started going wrong, because there were no archives with enough controls information. So, you know, from that story, it's our view that contracts kind of set the basis for project controls. It's where the requirements are specified, the level of details, the enforcement mechanisms are all found. So we did find barriers in terms and conditions relating to contracts, in terms and conditions, controllers' involvement and requirements being overruled. So that's the area we'll talk about. Okay, so the contract details are a key enabler for project controls, but we do have some issues here. So what we found in the survey was that 2 in 5 controllers did not know what the level of details were in the contract, or they thought that it was not that the level of details in the contract weren't appropriate. So they either weren't aware, or they certainly agreed they weren't appropriate. And there were important details missing, and it wasn't so clear. So it was the requirements could be interpreted in a number of different ways, or they were viewed as not being enforceable. There were other examples where the contracts were standard and they just didn't adjust well for the specific contract that was involved. So when we asked controllers what were the areas where the contract requirements were deficient, this graph here shows that apart from the bottom one, which was a bit more positive, there were significant gaps with the granularity of the data, the measuring and progressing rules of credit, change management requirements, and even the WBS and cost breakdown system mapping to the owner system. So these were key areas of lack of clarity, which immediately, it influenced the way that you can run your proper analysis, and you can't do forecasting, etc. So we've talked about the top 2. So now I'm just going to show you a piece of data relating to, so almost 40% of project controllers do not have input, do not provide input into the contracts. Now, when we looked into this question, our initial view was that they were staffed too late, but that was only about 9% of the time. There was another 9% where it was a standard contract, and so they just weren't, asked. And then the rest of the time was they just simply weren't included in the development of the contract. So the procurement culture or the commercial culture at the organisation was such that controllers it just wasn't thought of, and it wasn't part of the process. The final issue here was where contracts were negotiated down or they were not enforced. So there were a number of examples where the project manager or the contract manager, without the knowledge or agreement by project controls, altered terms in the contract or downplayed or downgraded the requirement for them to be followed. And so they basically eliminated the enforcement rights for those particular requirements that may have been in the contract. So when the contract inclusion is either ignored or not enforced, that we believe that's negative for project controls. So what needs to be done in terms of best practice to improve contracts, including project controllers in the contract negotiations, of course, along with staffing early. If they're not even there and on the team, then of course it makes it difficult for project controllers to participate in those negotiations and be part of those key decisions. Ensure that the contracts include the appropriate level of detail for the project and include the enforcement mechanisms. It is actually important to, where you do have adequate enforcement mechanisms, to make sure that as soon as the contract is enacted, that you begin, you enact those mechanisms. So if you don't let the first month go by without making sure that you have the reports and the data that the contract actually demands. If you do that, it then can be very, very difficult to, in future, enforce those mechanisms. So that's another area. Making sure that the elements of the contract in relation to project controls are very clear, and the best systems actually have some templates and some standards in relation to that, so that those requirements are not ambiguous in any way. And don't allow other team members to negotiate away contract requirements. And I guess that's also ties back to what we said before about in the organisation area, where you're building up with the organisation the value of controls. If your team members and the management group understand the value of controls, they're perhaps less likely to negotiate away those requirements. And as I said, go ahead and make sure that we enact those contracts straight away. All right, so now let's, what did the controllers' key tips, what did they have to say? So the key controller tips for dealing with contractual issues was making sure that there's good alignment with stakeholders on the agreed deliverables. So again, this actually ties back to having clear value of project controls well understood through the stakeholder group, and that cross-fertilisation, and having that then being inserted into the contract negotiations. And if the contracts are not good enough, communicate with contractors. If you do end up with a contract that is subpar, then immediately communicate with your partners and your contractors to clarify those details and discuss expectations and make sure that any vagueness is resolved. Some of the controllers believed that being physically close with the contractors helps with communication and also the owner team. And then in the cases where the contractors don't comply, the key tip was around escalation, getting management's buy-in and making sure that there's support to actually enforce the contracts. The stepping in and assisting contractors, again, this can apply if you're a prime contractor with subcontractor arrangements. It's the same thing. Step in and help with education and coaching and training. Ultimately, if a project, the various parties that work together to get a project done, if they're not working well together, it is going to be a very long project. So there's value in us doing what we can to work together and getting things resolved quickly. And then finally, adapting your tools and processes. So controllers said that they did sometimes implement certain methods, adapt workflows, and adapted, as they went through, relevant to the project, relevant to the contractor that they've ended up with, etc. So that was the feedback directly from the controllers in the contract space. Okay. Time for questions again.
Yeah, we can go to one of the questions because we are running out of time as well.
Yep.
Is there any argument from combining contracts and project controls into one group to ensure common goals, values?
I've never seen it done. I think this is just about the functions in the project working well together and understanding each other's roles. We're seeing more and more projects, some projects now where the commercial contracting team is the team. It's so sometimes in renewables that's the case, sometimes for junior developers that's the case. And so in that case, then, having someone relating to project controls probably added to that team would be a good idea. So I think this is more about just working together inside a normal project organisation structure. Okay, so let's talk about processes and tools. When we looked, so you might have a good organisation, your contracts might be fine, but if you have deficient tools and processes, then the day-to-day work of a controller gets challenging. We found barriers in terms of system readiness, deficient tools and misaligned processes. Similar to the table that I presented earlier, or the finding, when we asked about the controllers to rate the infrastructure of processes and tools, around 80% rated them from fair to poor across that scale of poor to excellent. Half of controllers indicated that project control systems are somewhat or not ready before execution. And 1 in 5 controllers indicated that they had no tools to integrate cost and schedule controls. So when the tools are not ready, that means that controllers have to delay their work to get those tools ready. And when there's no tools to integrate cost and schedule, it means a heap of manual work, which obviously is wasteful. The next point around, dealing with deficient tools drives inefficiencies. The types of inefficiencies that we found were things like, work duplication, generating reports with the same information, maybe in different formats to different stakeholders. Or another problem was excessive focus on detail, verifying down to the last penny and in a level of detail that didn't really drive key outcomes for the project. So how does this inefficiency of tools at the tool level affect the overall project? So if this chart here was the same tools rating between poor to excellent, and then this is the percent of those projects that were producing frequent and detailed reports during construction. So as you can see here, the tools rating actually did correlate with, just on this scale, improved reporting frequency. Now we know from other IPA research that improved bi-weekly, at least, bi-weekly and comprehensive reports per discipline improves both schedule effectiveness and reduces schedule slip. So the quality of the tools actually does, through the reporting frequency, actually affect project outcomes. So what needs to be done to improve tools and processes? Essentially ask the people who know, check with the controllers that the tools and processes that we're planning to adopt or use are appropriate. Where you do have good tools and processes, make sure we formalise those so that they're useful for future projects and they're systematised, and we're able to keep using them in the future. Another important point is to ensure that those tools and processes are part of your contract requirements and that they're tested with the contractor upon contract award. And that the use of the tools and processes are aligned amongst the stakeholders. So again, we're talking about, that how do we all work together, the value of project controls that does extend to the tools and processes. Investment is often required in tools and processes and the resources to run those. So the value of controls needs to be well understood. In terms of the key controller tips, I do note here that these are neither easy nor optimal to be doing in a live project. However, nonetheless, this is what they said that they did, which was to build their own tools or adapt them to fulfill project controls as early as you can, and just do the work to get the company to build the tools and processes with you. One controller told a story of that was their approach, and it took 8 months, but they did get there, and you know, ultimately that was beneficial. But no silver bullet really there with that. So to conclude the talk, we found over the decade that I showed that state of project controls hasn't really improved, and there is a gap between our aspirations for controls when we authorise the project and the actual controls that we end up implementing. When we don't meet our controls plans during execution, then we do see a degradation of predictability in both cost and schedule. From the survey data, you know, the three main barriers were in relation to project controls organisation, deficiencies in contracts and requirements, and misalignment around tools and processes. The improvements for the system have been nominated, and we've provided you with the key tips as well from the controllers. So there's just a summary here. I probably don't need to go through, but you know, the best practices that are needed for effective organisation, detailed and clear contracts, and aligned processes and tools. There are certainly some interconnectedness between these areas, but they all need to be addressed. Let's see if we can improve this trend. These are the relevant AACE recommended practices related to this topic. We produce at IPA a quarterly newsletter. If you go to the website, if you wish to subscribe, my details are here. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sally. Well, now I'm going to read some of the questions. One of the questions that Karen was doing was in regard of the barriers on the contract people. Have you, as a IPA, plan to maybe survey people from the contracts department?
Actually, at IBC, we did another study. We did a study on central procurement and the role of central procurement and some of the best practices. So IPA has for many years, well over 15 years, studied multiple times and repeated those studies around best practices for procurement. I actually can't tell you how many times I have made the recommendation that procurement and contracting needs to be, you know, on the project team and you know, participating as a you know, active member of the team. So it is something that we absolutely already know quite a lot about, and happy to talk to you about that.
Okay, I think we can move on to the open mic session.
Okay, before we move on,
sure that...
can I just thank Sally very much for her presentation, and we're very happy to have such an experienced person present to our organisation, and wish you all the luck down the future, Sally. Thank you very much.
No problem. So, thank you. Happy to participate. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll have an open mic session now. So Frank, you'll unmute everybody. Take it.